Good? Okay. Don't fall asleep. I know you have a full stomach. All right. Let's get started. That's me. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And if any of you is tweeting, I know we mentioned the hashtag #GIDS earlier. That's my name on Twitter, TL Berglund. You're welcome to mention that. Excuse me. In this talk, it's very important that I give some acknowledgments. The material in this talk came from this man. His name is Michael Roberto. He's a business professor. He's not a technologist at all. He's a professor of management at a university in Rhode Island on the east coast of the United States. So what does this guy have to do with this talk? Well, he produced a series of lectures for a company called The Teaching Company. Now, this is a website you can go to, teach12.com, and you can go download lectures on everything. There are lectures on mathematics and the sciences, history, art, all kinds of different topics, and some business topics also. And in particular, he produced a series of lectures called The Art of Critical Decision Making. I listened to him and I thought, wow, this is fascinating. This would make great material for a talk. Ultimately, though, he wasn't the original inspiration. Why are we talking about decision making as software professionals? Well, does anybody know this name, Alistair Cockburn? Anybody? I should say, if you have a question while I'm talking, just put your hand up and we'll get a microphone out to you, and then I'll tell you to sit down. No. If you have a question while I'm talking, please let me know. But this guy, Alistair Cockburn, looks like that. Picture's taken from his website, so he can't blame me. He is one of the original signers of the Agile Manifesto 10 years ago now. Alistair is. He's a very interesting fellow, and recently he's been talking about software development, not in terms of Agile development, but in terms of game theory. He says software development is a game. He says it's a particular kind of game. It's finite, cooperative, and goal-directed. Well, what does that mean? If we were talking about game theory, maybe we'd expand on that a little bit, but let's just say Alistair has this kind of organization of games. He says there are finite games and infinite games, cooperative games, competitive games, goal-directed games, open-ended games. And software development is this particular kind of game that's finite, cooperative, and goal-directed. And when we're playing this game, we have three moves we can make. Those moves are invent, communicate, and decide. That struck me when I originally read an article by Alistair where he said this. He said, invent, communicate, and decide. And I thought about it. And I thought, at a conference like this, we spend most of our time talking about inventing. You are, for the most part, here today, Microsoft developers, and you're interested in finding out how to be better at using Microsoft technologies and things in that stack and kind of in that universe. You want to gain skill there. You want to learn how to be better inventors, better developers. This is usually what preoccupies us. We also have the problem of communication with one another. All right? That's something that tends to be a problem as teams get larger. And I think in the US, there are stereotypes of what software developers are like, that we're very quiet and we sort of don't like to talk to people and we want to be left alone and close our door and have somebody shove a pizza under the door to keep us fed, and we'll just sit there and write code all day. And that's not really true. We're not really that bad at communicating as technology professionals. And I think even so, we realize that we could be a little better at this, and we spend time trying to be better communicators. But when I heard Alistair talk about inventing, communicating, deciding, it occurred to me, we don't spend a lot of time talking about decision-making, but we spend a lot of time engaged in decision-making. A lot of time. Mary Poppendick, who's the co-author of this book, Implementing Lean Software Development from Concept to Cash, has made the claim that developers make critical decisions every 15 minutes. Now think about that. When I read that, I thought, there was no footnote. It's not like she was referring to some study or something. Of course, now I can refer to her. I can say, well, Mary said 15 minutes. So she's my footnote. But I thought, that strikes me as true. I think that's about right. We spend a lot of time making decisions, and frequently we have to make big decisions, either by ourselves, as we are developing individually, or talking to other people. Sometimes the decisions are about silly things, like how to format your code, where to put the curly brace. That's not a very big decision. We argue about that sometimes. Sometimes they're very consequential things, like how to design an API or big, expensive architectural changes. So I think decision-making is a thing we need to pay more attention to as developers. And for the rest of this talk, briefly with you, I want to talk about decision-making in 3 different areas. First of all, as individuals. How is it that our minds work when we're working individually, not talking to other people? What are some problems that can go wrong with decisions we make then? Then I want to talk about how we work together as teams. What are some things that can go wrong in team decision-making? And then very briefly, we'll talk about aspects of organizational structure and organizational culture that can have an impact on us as individual decision-makers. So in each one of these areas, individual, team, and organizational, we're going to talk about the things that can go wrong and try to talk about the things that can fix them. And I think there should be some interesting observations we can make together. I usually give this talk to US audiences. I've given it a couple of times to European audiences. This is my first time in India. And so we might find interesting things to talk about. I might even say some things that you might disagree with and be able to correct me. And I'd love to hear about that. We could talk afterward if you have input for me on some of these ideas. So let's talk about individual decision-making. In particular, I want to break this down into a few categories. We'll talk about the cognitive biases, framing, the way we frame decisions, and let's get started. So the cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are just things that go wrong with our minds when we're thinking. These are little ways in which you and I are irrational. Now, we think of ourselves generally as rational people, and generally we are, but sometimes ever been overconfident. Nobody is saying yes. Yes. Of course you have. And when are you overconfident? When you're estimating, right? When you're trying to plan a new project. We all are. We always think it's going to be easier than it's going to be. Now, probably, let's just say you're beginning a new project and planning a new project. You just got done with a project. And maybe it was a fairly successful project, but almost certainly it took longer than you thought it was going to take, right? And you think to yourself, well, this next time, it's not going to be that bad. We made mistakes last time. There were things that surprised us. There are things we didn't see coming, but next time, we're going to get all those things right. And you think that every time. So we naturally are sort of hopeful and optimistic about the future, but that can lead us into making poor decisions by being overconfident about our own abilities or about how well a project is going to go. Well, how do we fix overconfidence? Number one, and this is the case with all the cognitive biases, you don't really fix it. It's always going to affect you a little bit. These are simply properties of our minds. But we still want to be good at estimating. Of course we do. So that really is worth an entire talk on its own. It's not something we can go into in detail. But if you want to be better at estimating, there are all kinds of great techniques that have emerged in the past 10 years or so, mostly coming out of the agile software movement, that are little games that we can play to help us be better at estimating. So be aware, overconfidence can affect you, can affect the way you make decisions, and if you want to guard against that in your planning, I would recommend that you read about agile estimation techniques. And those will help blunt the impact of overconfidence on you. Next is what I call sunk cost reasoning. This is another thing that each of us is guilty of. Sunk cost reasoning is when we pay too much attention to our past investment in a course of action, rather than what our marginal investment or future investment and marginal returns should be. Let me explain. About 6 years ago, I was working for a company. I'd been working there a number of years, and we had a database persistence framework. Something like in the Microsoft world you might use nhibernate for. Only it wasn't Hibernate, the Java version, it was our own that we built. And we had spent 6 years on it. It started very simple, and we had to add features, and we found bugs, and we just kind of poured our hearts into this thing. And then by about 2005, in the Java world, it had become quite standard to use Hibernate. And so it would have been a normal thing for us to migrate to Hibernate. So what did we do? Did we think, well, here's how much time it will take, and here's the rewards we'll get? No. We said, we can't do that. We've worked so hard. We've put so much effort into this. We've cried at night because it was so hard to get this thing working. We can't give up our baby now. That's an example of sunk cost reasoning. And it's good that we have kind of an emotional attachment to our work and that we're passionate about the work that we do. But it's very bad when we let that attachment to a prior course of action get in the way of making a good decision in the future. So you need to watch and listen to the way you talk about things. Do you hear yourself saying, we've put so much work into this, we've come so far, I've poured so much of myself into this? Again, it's good that you're attached to your work, but that's a sign that you may be engaged in sunk cost reasoning, and you should check yourself. The confirmation bias is where we tend to filter the inputs we take in order to conform them to some idea we have about the world. So say you're debugging a system, okay? And it's some complex server-side application, and you think the bug is some kind of threading problem that's happening under heavy load. All right, you think this only happens sometimes, it's happening under load. So what are you going to look for? You're going to tend to look at the logs and the behavior of the system when it's under heavy load. If it were maybe some simple configuration problem, you're not going to be really looking at configuration files because you think the problem is not there. You're paying attention to what's over here. You're filtering the inputs you're willing to take based on the ideas you already have, just causing you now to make bad decisions about how to debug that code, right? Again, every time I explain confirmation bias, I feel like I'm accusing people of something really bad. It just sounds so terrible. You know, like I'm going to ignore everything that doesn't tell me that I'm right and only pay attention to the things that tell me that I am right. You know, man, that sounds terrible to me. So how do you fix this? Well, again, you have to realize you're going to do this, especially under stress or high anxiety situations. You're much more likely to do this. But what helps here is to have a diverse team of people with different perspectives who are all able to communicate those perspectives. A team where everybody feels like they can say, hey, you know what, Tim, I think you're wrong. And nobody feels like they're going to get in trouble for telling me that I'm wrong, or like that's going to start a fight or anything like that. To get rid of confirmation bias, we need lots of people with different opinions. That way, I could just sort of let my confirmation bias do its thing. And as long as you have a different belief about the world or the system we're debugging or whatever it is, we will tend to kind of even each other out a little bit. Blaise Pascal was a French mathematician and scientist, and late in his life, he was a philosopher. He kind of quit math and science and became a philosopher for a few years. And one of his most famous books is called The Pensées, which is French for thoughts. Pensées is kind of like Pascal's Twitter feed. It wasn't really a book that would had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was just a bunch of little statements. And the original manuscript that he wrote really wasn't even organized all on pages. There were things kind of written all over the place. So it was this big, messy thing. But he had this very beautiful way of describing the way we are with our cognitive biases. Now, he wasn't thinking about cognitive biases directly, but he was thinking about the way sometimes we can get things right and get things wrong. He said, you know, we can be very miserable, but we can know about our miseries. And he presented this image that we were sort of like a king or a queen in that we could be very rational and do good things, but it's like we weren't always on the throne. And sometimes we were off of that throne and being very irrational. So I like this image he had of deposed royalty. A behavioral economist might say, instead of deposed royalty, might say we are boundedly rational. Rational some of the time, but not all the time. And that really sums up the cognitive biases. Pay attention to them. Framing, the way we frame a decision, can have a huge impact on the way a decision maker thinks about it. So let's suppose you learn about some exciting technologies today, and you go back to work tomorrow or Friday. Tomorrow or Thursday. Today's Tuesday. I'm still on U.S. time, so I don't even know what day it is. But let's suppose you go back to work, you learn about some exciting technology, say, boss, I would like us to adopt this new technology. Now, the way you frame that decision is going to change the way your boss thinks about risk. So let's say, you say, boss, we need to upgrade our technology Because if we don't, I think some of our best people are going to quit. Because we're using old technologies here, and they can go get a more exciting job doing something they'll like better with newer technologies. So I'm framing that decision as a threat. I'm saying, you are in danger, and you need to protect yourself. Or I could say, boss, I learned about this new technology. I think it's going to make us a lot more productive. We're going to be able to deliver a lot more features and do better. So now I'm framing that as not a threat, but an opportunity. So there's threat framing and opportunity framing. What I've done automatically by framing a decision as a threat is I've caused my boss to be more willing to take risk. Okay, if I'm under threat, I'm going to take chances to try to respond to that. If I frame it as an opportunity, I've made my boss less willing to take risk because he thinks, well, everything's kind of okay as we are. We're just trying to do a little bit better, and I don't really need to take any chances. I'm not going to go bet the farm on this crazy new technology you're telling me about. But when I use risk framing, so, boss, you're under threat, and, you think, okay, I'm going to get my boss to take more chances. People also tend to be less creative under threat and more creative when using opportunity framing. So isn't that interesting? Those changes happen automatically. And we can set up experiments that measure this. It's extremely predictable. People's tolerance for risk flips depending on whether we're using threat or opportunity framing. So what do? Well, I don't like to tell people, hey, use these psychological tricks to try to manipulate the people around you. I don't like to relate to people that way. But I like to realize this is just a property of how our minds work. And the way we frame a decision affects the way we think about risk automatically. So we can use this now to use mixed threat opportunity framing to help your boss think, or whatever the decision maker is, think more completely about a problem. So I could say, I want to adopt this new technology because it's going to help us be more productive, and I think if we don't, people are going to quit. So I'm presenting the opportunity and the threat, so I'll get the best of both worlds. That's really it for individual decision making. Let's talk a little bit about how we work in teams. I want to talk about a few things, what we call process losses, the terrible, terrible problem of groupthink, and how to deal with conflict, and problems that teams have committing to a course of action, and how that can affect decision making. What's a process loss? Well, the whole idea in working together on a team is that together we can produce a better decision or a better outcome than any of us can individually. I'm limited in the knowledge I have, the insight I have, the creativity I have. If we get together and use some process to work out a decision together, we'll be able to pool our combined intelligence, creativity, and insight to produce a better decision. When that process is working, that happens, and together we do better than we do individually. When it breaks down, we have what's called a process loss. I'm sure all of you have been in meetings where you've said, wow, if I could just get out of this meeting, if I could just make these people stop talking, I could just go make a decision and go get some work done. And maybe that only happens in the companies I've worked in, but I'm sure you've been there. That's an indication of process loss. Again, the idea is none of us individually is as smart as all of us together. But too often we've been in this situation where you felt, wow, all of us together, we're actually much dumber than any individual in this room. And if we would just break up, it would be better. So that's what we want to get away from. There are a number of reasons for process losses. And one of them is the pressure for conformity. Now, different people have different attitudes about conformity. I grew up in the United States. I tend to have this idea that conformity is somehow bad. And I'm just a total individual, and I totally think for myself, and I never care what anybody else says. That's not true. That's really not true. I know people who are even worse than I am, who think, wow, I'm a total lone wolf, and nobody's ever going to tell me what to do. Now, The only person who really doesn't care what other people think is what? There's a name for that. That's a sociopath. Okay, there's a psychological diagnosis for the person who doesn't care about conformity at all. Everybody does, but sometimes when a group, a software team, cares too much about that and no one is able to disagree, this can cause problems. We'll revisit conformity several times. So conformity is a cause of process loss. Keep that in your mind. Sometimes fault lines can cause process loss. Let's suppose you are in an agile team, and an agile team is a cross-functional team. So you're delivering, let's say, some web-based business application. You've got a database backend, you've got a rich front end with all kinds of awesome HTML5 and JavaScript stuff, and you're just really happy about it. And maybe you've got some kind of middle tier, right? And every 2 weeks, this team delivers some new feature that means there's database changes, and there's business logic changes, and there's front-end changes. Everybody on the team works together, and you've got specialists on the front end and specialists on the back end. And those front-end people and those back-end people, they don't always get along, do they? They're kind of different groups. These are like kind of artistic people on the front end who are good at JavaScript and HTML and know how to make colors go together. I don't know how to make colors go together. I have to use programs that tell me how colors match. Then over here you have like the back-end people. They know SQL. Okay, they write stored procedures. They know databases. They think, those people over there, you guys are lightweights. All right? You don't do the hard stuff. And the front-end people over here, you think, you guys are so uncivilized, you dress badly, and your HTML is ugly. Right? These are the stereotypes. And to some extent, they're true. And that's all fine. And that even can work to our advantage. But when in a single team, those divisions become really a fault between the two. So I stand over here as a back-end developer, and I say, you guys over there, I'm not listening to you. When you're talking, I'm not listening because you're a front-end person. You don't know how to make these decisions. Now, the front-end people over here are saying, there's a back-end guy talking. I'm not going to listen to him. He doesn't know anything about what he's talking about in the user interface. I don't care. I'm plugging my ears. That's a fault line. And what that means is the team is not really behaving as a team. It's behaving as two separate teams. So this can be a source of process loss. Also, the inability to manage airtime can be a problem. When a team meets together to have discussions and tries to make decisions about how to build software, it means everybody has to talk, right? And when I say everybody has to talk, I mean everybody has to talk. Suppose you were unlucky enough maybe to have like a conference speaker on your team or something. I do write code, actually, and I like to talk, and I'm just passionately in love with the sound of my own voice, which means sometimes I might want to do a lot of talking when we're all debating something. There are other people in the world who don't need to be the one talking all the time and don't like to speak up and have to be encouraged to give their opinion, especially if there are other people talking all the time who just love to hear the sound of their own voice, like maybe me. And these quiet people are then never going to contribute. So again, we have an imbalanced team. This is a process loss. It might as well just be the loudmouth all by himself in the room. And so if you are a leader of a team like this, you actually have to take steps. You have to be directive and say to the loudmouth person, or potential loudmouth person, not necessarily me, hey, it's time for you to stop talking. And over there, quiet person, I would like your opinion. Would you please tell us what you think? You actually have to tell people, you quiet, you loud, to help balance airtime. There can also be problems with information flow, and I think this is just fascinating. So let's suppose you've got kind of what I would consider a traditional hierarchical team. There's a leader, and there are direct reports underneath that leader. And let's suppose you are that leader, and you took a job as tech lead, and they told you, oh, it's okay. 5% of your time is going to be management. It's still 95% coding. It's mostly code. And you said, yeah, that's right. And they said, you don't get extra money, but it's a lot of responsibility, and this looks good for you. And you say, yeah, okay. And you took the job, and it turns out it was 95% management and 5% code, and you spent that 5% of your time trying to remember how to write code. And the rest of your team is busy coding away. They're lucky. They just get to do what they love all day, and you spend all this time managing. But because you're the lead, you still have to make these decisions. And let's suppose you're called upon to make a decision about adopting some new standard, some new product, doing something that's going to matter a lot for the team. You don't really know the things you need to know to make that decision. Your people know them, and they have to tell you, and you have to weigh the pros and cons and make the decision. You're relying on that information flowing to you. This is another thing where it sounds like, maybe there's somebody on the team who doesn't like you, and they don't want to tell you, so you'll make a mistake and you'll look bad. So they're going to keep information from flowing to you. But I think often information flow problems happen with the best of intentions. Let me tell you a story about a company that I worked with. It was a fairly small technology organization, about 6 people, in a company of about 40 or 50 people. It was a trucking company. And they were in the middle of a big technology transition, rewriting a bunch of stuff, ugly, ugly legacy system, a beautiful future. There's this guy on the team named Stan. Stan is a great guy. Just a servant to the business, easy to get along with. Everybody liked him. And there would be this problem with one of the applications that the business would call him 2 or 3 times a day, and they'd get on the phone, they'd say, Stan, the audit program is slow. Make it fast. And so Stan would go remote desktop over to this server, and he'd reset a service. It had a memory leak. So he'd go bounce that, and they'd go, oh, thanks, Stan, audit's fast now, okay, bye. And 2 or 3 times a day he would do this. And he didn't complain, because he didn't like to complain. He was a nice guy, he just wanted to help. Until he went on vacation, and those calls now started going to his boss, who suddenly is saying, why am I getting called 3 times a day to remote desktop to a server and restart a service? This is silly. Well, Stan wasn't trying to make anybody look bad or do anything wrong. He was just trying to help. But in the process of trying to help and not complain and be easy to get along with, that information didn't flow to the boss. The boss wasn't able to decide how to allocate resources in the next sprint. You can believe when Stan got back from vacation, that change was made. And time was scheduled to fix that problem, and they found the memory leak, and Stan didn't get those phone calls anymore. So information flow can happen with the best of intentions. Pardon me. Groupthink is a relatively new term. It's a term that was coined, I think, in the early 1960s by a guy named Irving Janis, a social psychologist named Irving Janis. And this is a word that in the U.S. is a pretty commonplace word. You can just use it and people kind of know what you mean. But this is where the pressure for conformity in a group becomes so great that people will actually censor themselves. They'll say, I think what the group wants to do is wrong, but I don't want to speak up because it's more important that everybody agrees than for me to say what I want to say. Or if somebody does speak up, if there's somebody who doesn't know the rules of this group, and they say, wait, I think you're wrong, I don't think we should make that change, people will jump on that person right away and say, oh, that's stupid, stop disagreeing with the group. So this is a problem. This is when conformity there becomes to be too much of a value on conformity in a group. So what you have, instead of this nice, diverse group of people who think differently and can share their ideas, is instead you get the Borg. You get a hive mind, and that's not really what you want. You want a group of different people who are able to express ideas differently. How do you tell when groupthink is happening? Well, we might say you're new to a team and 2 or 3 weeks goes by and nobody's really disagreeing about anything. And you realize you're software developers and it's been 3 weeks and nobody's had an argument. This could be a problem, okay? Or you might be able to tell if you're just observing, if you're brand new to a team, and is there some leader? Now maybe it's the person who is formally the leader in the formal organization, like they have a title that says they're the boss, and these are their direct reports. But sometimes it can be the head of the informal organization. Sometimes somebody who isn't necessarily the boss can be the team hero. And can you observe the team and can you see that person always needs to speak first? Everybody always waits. They keep their mouth shut and look and maybe actually make eye contact or look over to see what the hero is going to do before they feel free in giving their opinion. That can be a sign that groupthink is going on. Even if you don't get to observe the team for very long, you might see that there's somebody here who needs to speak first, that the team is kind of given that role to, whether they should have it or not. One way to fix this is to make conflict a safe thing on the team. Remember, we are assuming that working in groups, working in teams together is better. We're trying to pool our intellect, pool our insight, pool our creativity. We all want to be able to bring our ideas together. And sometimes when we do that, you'll have some idea. I'll come here with a proposal A. And you'll come to the team with proposal B. We'll say, okay, I want A, you want B. Let's talk about it for a little bit. And we talk about it. We say, you know what? I think we're both wrong. Here is idea C that now we both love. And everybody embraces that and everybody wins. And isn't that nice? Because everybody wins. The point when we're trying to make conflict a safe thing is that sometimes there will be a winner and sometimes there will be a loser. And both of those outcomes need to be things that you are ready to accept. You need to be ready to engage in conflict, ready to lose and still be a part of the team, even ready to win and have your friend lose and still be a part of the team. So, what can we do to make conflict a safe thing on a team? I don't necessarily think that teddy bears are required for this, but the idea of psychological safety is a requirement. And what I mean by this is everybody on the team has to believe that dissenting from the majority opinion is a safe thing to do. So if everybody embraces a particular schema structure for the new application, and you think that a radically different schema structure is called for, and you're willing to put that idea forth to the team, what do you believe is going to happen to you? Now, your boss might say, I always want to hear your opinion, even if it's different from mine. But you'll know whether your boss is really telling the truth there, or whether the team is really telling the truth. People figure out very quickly whether they're going to be punished for being different from the majority opinion of the group or not. And what we want is this condition of psychological safety where people believe that disagreeing is okay, because the results of disagreeing are never negative for them. Maybe we have an argument, but people are not personally punished or made to feel like they don't belong to the team. How can you do this? If you have a team where maybe people have trouble disagreeing, what are some things we could do to make this feel like a comfortable thing for us to do? Well, I think there's a great story to tell about a company that's very popular in the U.S. called the Build-A-Bear Workshop. I did not check. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Does that exist in South India? Build-A-Bear Workshop. All right, this is great. Let me tell you about it. You're going to want one. Who has young girls, little girls, under 10? Anybody? Okay. I used to. My youngest is almost 12 now. We're almost out of the Build-A-Bear phase. But Build-A-Bear is a store that you go to where little kids go to get stuffed animals, except the stuffed animals aren't finished. They're empty, and there's this machine that stuffs them, and they take a little heart that they can squish and stick it in there, and they stuff it full, and they sew it up, and it's very cute. Then you buy expensive clothes to put on the bear, and it costs a lot of money, and dads like me get kind of tired of it after a while. But they're cute. They're stuffed animals. The lady who started this company is a lady named Maxine Clark. All right, it's a very successful global company, $350 million U.S. annual revenue, and it's all about stuffed animals and getting children to make them in stores. When Maxine Clark was a little girl in school, she had a teacher who gave a weekly writing assignment. And as a part of this weekly writing assignment, there was an award for the student who made the most mistakes, called the Red Pencil Award. Okay, you're thinking about that. You're thinking, I could have won that. Right, okay, good. Now here's the catch. you couldn't get credit for the same mistake twice. So what does that communicate to the class, the red pencil award? That communicates to the class that being different, making a mistake, a certain kind of failure, and a certain kind of nonconformity is acceptable, but only a certain kind. Failure in general isn't encouraged. This wasn't a race to the bottom to see who could make the worst paper ever. This was encouraging people to take risks, even if that resulted in being different and it resulted in failure, as long as you learned from the mistake. So if you have a group where people are maybe a little afraid to disagree or afraid to take chances where they might be seen as wrong or different, maybe something like a red pencil award would be a good idea. So how would we do this? A suggestion that I have is maybe if you've got some kind of sprint or iteration schedule to your work. So you have these maybe 2-week iterations, and you have a meeting at the end of the iteration that says a retrospective, where you look back on that iteration and say, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? How could we improve? So forth. Well, in a meeting like that, where you're looking at yourselves and looking at how you could have done better, maybe give some kind of award, a gift certificate, or some actual cash, a prize to the person who says, here's the biggest mistake I made in the last 2 weeks. Now, could you do that? Would you be willing to say, compete? Would you be willing to compete for whose mistake was the worst? And be able to tell your peers, I messed up and here's how I learned from it. Well, if that would be a scary thing for you, maybe that's a sign that some kind of system of reward, some kind of red pencil award would be a good idea. We talked a little bit about fault lines before. We can use fault lines to our advantage if there is a little bit of division on a team. Maybe it's not to the point where people don't trust each other, they're willing to listen, but naturally you've got the front-end people or the back-end people, or you've got people who prefer this technology or that technology, and so forth. These are the MVC people, and these are the not MVC people on the other side. You might get them to argue. If you're trying to debate a decision, cut that team down the middle and say, okay, you guys over here, tell us why MVC is so great. You guys over here, tell us why your proposal is so great. And use those divisions to help stimulate disagreement on the team. Again, in this case, you as a leader are trying to get people to feel comfortable with disagreement. And so you can use those natural divisions, as long as they're not unhealthy divisions, to get people to fight with one another. Different people come from different family backgrounds. If you've got a team with people from different national backgrounds, or if you work maybe with American companies, people who grew up in completely different countries, people come with different ideas about what conflict means and what kind of conflict is even appropriate. So you have to be sensitive to that. You have to realize that person's family background might make them think about conflict in a different way. That person's cultural background might make them think about conflict in a different way. And you have to be ready to pick up on that and learn the skills to engage in conflict even across those boundaries. We can make important distinctions about conflict, like between affective and cognitive conflict. Cognitive conflict is about ideas and outcomes. Affective conflict is more about people. If we're having an affective conflict, I'm arguing about you because I don't like you. If we're having a cognitive conflict, I'm arguing with you about your ideas and my ideas. Of course, the solution, I pick Kirk and Spock here intentionally, the solution is not to try to remove emotion from our technology debates. For two reasons. Number one, you can't. Because you are an emotional creature. You have emotions. There's nothing you can do about it. Number two, I don't even think you want to. I think you want to work with people who are passionate about their work. So the solution isn't to remove emotion. The solution is to concentrate on the ideas and not on each other. And do keep in mind, when we're talking about emotion, that if you're successful in getting people to engage in conflict, if you do a good job at this, and people fight it out in difficult decisions, then there may be some emotional damage. And if you're the leader, you might just, sit next to that person at the next meeting. Make sure they know they're still a part of the team. Some teams have problems with what we call the culture of no. The culture of no is where a team has a person, maybe it's a particular team hero, one person who's anointed on that team who can shoot down any decision. Somebody proposes something, one person can veto it, say no. That's the culture of no. That can make it very hard to come to a conclusion. We also have the culture of yes, where you're in the room debating a decision, and while you're in the room, while you're debating, everybody says, yes, that sounds good to me. Let's do that. Okay, this is the plan. This is the plan for the next 2 weeks of work. Yes, that sounds good. And then as soon as you leave, everybody goes to their IM windows and starts talking about what a terrible decision that is. They said yes in the room, but they say no out of the room. That's the culture of yes. Also a terrible thing for decision making, something you cannot allow. Then there's the culture of maybe. The culture of maybe is where we can never actually commit to a decision. We feel like we always need to get a little bit more input, or we are able to revisit a decision even if we don't have new information. So people begin to believe we never really come to a decision in the first place. So if there isn't new information, don't allow people to bring up the question again once the team has made the decision. Now, let me give you just a few concluding ideas here. If you only remember one thing, please remember that when you're thinking about decision making as a team, if you're a leader, it's appropriate for you to be directive about process, for you to tell people, for instance, you be quiet, you talk, or stop debating decisions after we've made them. Only debate them in the room. You could be directive about process, but never tell people what to think or what to decide. You can't be directive about content. When it comes to the cognitive biases and framing and individual decision making, think of yourself as the kind of person who can make decisions poorly. Sometimes you get it wrong. Just recognize your limits and structure your relationships around you and your team around you to help protect you from that. When it comes to you in the team, a question for you. Does anybody recognize the poem or the story that this picture comes from? Just shout it out if you know. It's from Beowulf, which it was written in Denmark in about 750 AD. I gave this talk in Norway once, and I asked them that question, and about 50 people said, Beowulf! So they were familiar with it. Beowulf is a story of a hero, a superhero, who killed a monster that no other hero could kill. He became king, and he was such a powerful hero that none of his nobles wanted to rise up to replace him. He was surrounded by weak nobles because he was so strong. This is what we do often on software teams. The problem of heroism in our teams is terrible. Where there's one very strong person, we all look to that person. And often everyone else on the team can become very weak and not contribute. So the idea is you want a team of people, all of whom can contribute to development work, development decision-making, all of those things. You don't want the Beowulf problem. At the end of his life, his kingdom was attacked by a dragon, even when he was an old man, and none of his nobles would fight the dragon. He had to fight it as an old man. He killed the dragon, but then he died, and that's where the poem ends. Just kind of trails off with the king dying, and the dragon dead, and a big pile of gold, and no leader, and countries that wanted to come in and plunder them. So don't let Beowulf happen to you. We didn't really talk about organizational decision-making at all, and that is okay, because often at our level we're developers. We don't get to do the things that directors and executives get to do. But we can be people who can look around in our organizations for things that are affecting us and trickling down into our teams. So with that, thank you very much. I'll be around afterward if anyone wants to talk. Thank you for your attention.